Good morning, everyone. I am John OLoughlin. Welcome to my channel. It's called Macduff Lives. And we are continuing this morning with our reading of the book Cassidy's Run by David Wise, a nonfiction book that reads like a novel. However, the facts in there really happened, and they involve my dad. So very, very interesting book and very nice writing. I'm really enjoying reading it. The sentences flow and the plot thickens, as they say, as we get to chapter 13, Ixora, Ixora, and it begins in July of 1971, which is 1 month after my father's passing, just to put it in context of my life and Macduff's life. So we've reached the point in the book at which things that are happening after Macduff's death, but his name still appears in the book later, and we will get to that soon. Really enjoyed my conversation with Mike Billington last night of EIR, and wish them great success with their 2-day conference there at Schiller Institute. I tuned in this morning before the show, and I intend to get back with them after we finish with the Macduff show this morning. They really love Beethoven over there, and actually my musical awakening kind of came through Beethoven as well, and it kind of comes full circle then to me. My little sister and I used to play Beethoven records, and she used to make faces like the pictures of Beethoven on the album covers. Well, anyway, that was when I was pretty young, and now I find a group of people that are really fanatics about Beethoven, and deservedly so. So I'll be reawakening my Beethoven consciousness. Not that I really ever lost it, but anyway, great to have them playing some music along with their philosophical and political analysis. You know, it's all about being human. Okay, we're up to part 7 here of Cassidy's Run. I'm chapter 13. The chapters are fairly short, and I will begin after I grab a sip of coffee. Okay, this chapter is called Ixora, Ixora. When Cassidy, still on active duty, had met with Mikhail Danilin in Washington in July 1971, the microdot inside the hollow rock that he retrieved at his drop site contained an extraordinary set of instructions. Cassidy was ordered, if he detected military preparations for war, to call a telephone number in New York City. The instructions also provided the parole, P-A-R-O-L, or recognition dialogue, that Cassidy was to speak to the man who answered the telephone. The microdot gave the man's name as Edmund Freundlich and his address as Apartment 1A, 2770 Kingsbridge Terrace, Bronx, New York, 10463. The FBI quickly verified that this was in fact the name and address of the man in Apartment 1A. Clearly, Edmund Freundlich was a Soviet sleeper agent, a faceless spy among the millions of people in New York City whose job was to serve as a sort of one-man early warning system in the event of a planned nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. A sleeper agent is a long-term spy planted inside an enemy country with orders to engage in a minimal amount of espionage activities, or none at all, so that he can be activated primarily in case of war or an emergency. While no target was specified, the primary concern of the Russians was obviously to obtain advance news of an attack against the Soviet Union. A warning call that the United States was mobilizing against some other country would certainly have been of interest to the Soviets as well, but whatever other duties they may have assigned him may have been assigned to him by Moscow, Edmund Freundlich's most important job was to wait for the phone call that might mark the start of World War III. If Freundlich ever received a phone call alerting the Soviets to a nuclear attack, the conversation would be cryptic and the meaning indecipherable to anyone who overheard it. On the microdot Cassidy got from Danilin, he was told that if he had to make the call, he was to go to a payphone, dial the number, and inquire about an order for books. Cassidy was instructed to say, "Mr. Freundlich, that's Rex. How about my order for and indicating a future date, books?" The number given would signify the number of days until the attack and would depend upon the circumstances. In the microdot, Cassidy was given an example of three numbers, 11, 22, and 55. The numbers were to be understood as single digits. Thus, 11 would mean 1 day, 22, 2 days, and so on. For example, if Cassidy called on October 10th and believed an attack would be launched on October 12th, he was to say, "That's a Rex. How about my order for 22 books?" Freundlich was to respond, "For 22, it's okay." After that, Cassidy was instructed by the Soviets to just hang up the receiver. He was to follow up with a letter which would appear to be a business letter confirming the book order. But on the back of the letter, using secret writing, he was directed to provide details of the planned U.S. attack. There was only one problem with the instructions Cassidy received on the microdot. The phone number he had been given by the Russians was wrong. The last 2 digits were transposed. Cassidy had been told to call a number ending with 2835, but when the FBI looked up Edmund Freundlich in the Bronx telephone book, it found that his number ended in 2853. One would suppose that with the warning of a possible nuclear Armageddon depending upon Joe Cassidy, the GRU would have made sure that the telephone number he had been given was correct. But the devil is in the details, and things often go wrong in the spy business, as in any other human endeavor. This, however, was a wrong number to end all wrong numbers. To the Bureau, the fact that the GRU had provided the true name and address of its sleeper in New York was seen as further evidence that Moscow completely trusted Joe Cassidy. For the Soviets to share this information with Cassidy was an extraordinary expression of confidence in him. Operation Shocker had now flushed 3 illegals: Gilberto Lopez y Rivas, his wife Alicia Lopez, and Edmund Freundlich. The FBI opened a new case file on Edmund Freundlich. At the Bureau's headquarters in Washington, Gene Peterson gave him his own code name, Ixora, I-X-O-R-A. Ixora is a tropical plant that Peterson had cultivated in his garden in Tampa, where he worked for the FBI before coming to Washington. It's also called the iron bush because the trunk would get a black mold on it, he said. It has a beautiful red flowers. It only blossoms on second-year wood. When you trim it, you have to know it won't bloom until 2 years later. It's like forsythia in that way. A reclusive 52-year-old bachelor, Freundlich seemed an unlikely spy. He appeared to have few friends and to live a drab, colorless existence. But perhaps that is precisely why he was chosen for his role, a gray man who blended in almost invisibly into the background. Edmund Freundlich, according to records of the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service, was born in Vienna on April 14, 1999. The family name means friendly in German and is pronounced freundlich. In March 1938, Hitler's army marched into Austria, and the country was annexed as a part of the Third Reich. On August 14th, 5 months after the Anschluss, Freundlich, then 19, entered Switzerland at Diepoldsau, just across the Rhine from Austria, as a refugee from the Nazis. Freundlich spent the war in refugee camps in Switzerland. According to records of the Swiss police in the canton of St. Gallen, he spent time in a camp at Schönengrund near Appenzell, and for 4 years, from February 1940, he was in a camp at Diepoldsau. The police file showed that from November 13, 1944 until April 20, 1945, he was at the immigrant work camp at Zurich-Seebach. He left Switzerland and returned to Austria on August 29, 1945. But the bare-bones records of the Swiss police do not tell the whole story. Two of Edmund Freundlich's brothers also made their way to Switzerland in 1939 and later to the Dominican Republic. His brother Oswald emigrated to New York in 1951 and went into business chartering cargo ships. According to Oswald's son, Robert, Edmund's mother, Anna, was a Catholic who converted to Judaism when she married her father, Wilhelm. Wilhelm was abusive and gambled away his wife's small business. Anna and Wilhelm tried to enter Switzerland at some point, but were turned back. I'm not sure if they were stopped at the border or got in and were turned back and went to occupied France. We found their names on the train list, the trains that went to Auschwitz. Edmund's brother Oswald also was sent to the refugee camp in Switzerland at Schönengrund, where he met his future wife, Gina. A Swiss guard, later honored in Israel for his actions, forged documents and saved Gina and her entire family, as well as other refugees who lacked required papers and would otherwise have been shipped back to Germany and the death camps. After the war, Robert recalled, Edmund had a complete breakdown and was institutionalized in Austria for up to a year. I visited him in 1964. He worked in the Austrian equivalent of our Social Security. That was the first time I ever met him. It was an overwhelming experience. He looked so much like my dad. It was stunning. Sponsored by his brother, on April 16, 1968, Edmund Freundlich was admitted to the United States on an immigrant visa after swearing he would not engage, quote, in espionage or other activities subversive to the national security. On his visa application, he listed his address as Kirchberggasse 24, Vienna, and his occupation as office worker. His decision to leave Austria for America puzzled Robert's wife, Jill. Quote, for many years he didn't want to come here, she said. Then, suddenly, he wanted to come. What his family did not know, of course, was that he had been recruited by Soviet intelligence and was to work as a spy in New York. Jill was fond of Uncle Edmund. He had almost a childlike quality. He gave very thoughtful, wonderful presents to the children. He was good-looking, tall. He had a poet's face, sandy hair. He was almost 6 feet tall. He lived in Kingbridge Terrace in a very poor neighborhood, mainly Hispanic. He lived in a hovel. His apartment was small and dirty. He kept every piece of paper, newspapers, piled floor to ceiling. He never married. He never brought a date to a family gathering. He did not seem interested in material things. He was into natural things and holistic medicine. He was a lovely, sweet, genuinely nice person, a good-hearted person. If you didn't go onto politics, anything controversial, he was lovely. He had a healthy distrust of the government and was pro-Russia. He hated the way the Americans treated the Indians, pushed them off their land, and was still treating them badly. He talked openly about liking the Russians. There would be political debates. Robert would argue with him. Robert Freundlich confirmed that he got into political arguments with his uncle. He was not so much pro-Russian as anti-U.S., a highly neurotic man. It was extremely difficult to have rational discussions with him. A year after Edmund arrived in the United States, he went to work at Pergamon Press in Elmsford, New York, near Tarrytown, at a salary of $13,000 a year. He commuted by bus each weekday. This may not have been a random choice of an employer. The man who owned Pergamon Press, Robert Maxwell, born Ian Ludwig Hoch in Czechoslovakia, also fled the Nazis in 1939 and built a publishing empire in Britain and the United States, acquiring the Mirror Group in London, the New York Daily News, and the American publishing company Macmillan, in addition to Pergamon. Maxwell was close to the Soviets, and a number of his executives at Pergamon were also from Eastern Europe. Whether Maxwell had any knowledge that he had a Russian spy on his payroll is unknown, but whether by chance or not, Freundlich obtained work with the one publisher in the United States who maintained friendly relations with the Soviets during the Cold War. Pardon me. Laszlo Straka was president of the publishing house in 1971 when Cassidy was given his microdot instructions. He said Maxwell started the press in the late 1950s as a subsidiary of the British parent company of the same name. Born in Hungary, Straka spent his whole career working for the Maxwell interests. Quote, "We were a scientific technical publisher, and the American branch also published some journals," Straka recalled. Edmund Freundlich was a low-level employee. He actually worked for a separate company, also headquartered at Pergamon, with the same phone number, called Maxwell Scientific International, which bought and sold back issues of scientific journals. It was run by Dr. Edward Gray, originally Ed Grunberg, a Romanian Jew. It was Dr. Gray, now dead, who hired Edmund Freundlich. He worked as a cataloger of the scientific journals, so he was in the record end of things. He also carried around his lunch in a little brown bag. I knew he was from Europe, a quiet sort of man, kept to himself. Straka confirmed that Maxwell had strong links to the Russians. The English Pergamon did a fair amount of Soviet translations, and Maxwell considered himself a sort of ambassador to the Soviets and visited Russia frequently. We distributed Soviet scientific journals in the United States. Robert Miranda, a former vice president of Pergamon, also remembered Freundlich. Quote, "He was a sort of reclusive type of guy, very smart, but a loner. He collected all kinds of material. He was a continuous collector of junk. I wondered if it had to do with his years in the camps." Lori Miranda, Robert Miranda's daughter, worked directly with Freundlich. I worked for the microfilm department, and Eddie worked with back issues. We all sat in the same room. The thing I remember most about him, he was a pack rat. The microfilm used to come in little square boxes. Every once in a while, I gave him the boxes, and he was very excited. Offbeat, but a nice guy. One time, he drew a picture of a thumb and put it on the wall and wrote, "Press here." People would come over and press it. It was a joke. Eddie enjoyed that. Freundlich was placed under surveillance by the FBI, and his apartment was wiretapped. His own brother had trouble feigning interest in Edmund's life. The FBI listened to Edmund on the telephone, talking on and on to his brother, and Oswald would start to snore. Donald E. Lord, a former FBI agent and one of many assigned to watch Ixora, said the Bureau discreetly moved into Freundlich's apartment house. We had an apartment in the same building. He was on the ground floor, we were on the third floor, but we could see him from the window when he went out and walked across the courtyard. It was frustrating. He didn't do anything. He would just ride the subway or walk around the Bronx. Charles T. Weiss, that's W-E-I-S, who headed the Bureau's GRU squad in New York, remembered the lookout post because he had lugged a spare bedroom set from his house and wrestled it into the Bronx apartment with the help of another FBI agent. Quote, "We had spot surveillance on Ixora because he was so predictable," Weiss said. "Initially, we were on him all the time. It wasn't necessary to maintain continuous surveillance once we established a pattern. What time he went to work and when he came home and what he did on weekends. We could see whatever he did, which wasn't very much. He was a real lost soul." Edgar Dade formed much the same impression of Ixora. He was a strange bird, pale complexion, frail. You would never think he was a spy. You would never think he was anything. Dade did remember one incident. Late at night, Freundlich left his apartment and took a trip by subway to Manhattan. "I was on the surveillance," Dade said. "It was difficult because the train was almost empty." Dade watched as Freundlich got off in Midtown and went to the main post office, where he mailed a letter. In Soviet intelligence procedure, that was considered a safer way to mail a letter, Dade said. The probable reason, he explained, is that if a spy is seen dropping a letter in a mailbox, it can be retrieved by a counterintelligence agency more easily than if it is mixed in with thousands of letters at a central post office. He was definitely doing something, Dade added. You don't normally, let me turn the page, go all the way downtown from the Bronx at night by subway to mail a letter. Freundlich often traveled around New York City, mostly by subway, and some of his trips, such as his late-night excursion to the main post office, appeared to be related to an intelligence purpose. On December 9th, 1971, with the Bureau listening in on his phone, Freundlich received a cryptic call late at night. The call might have been a warning of some kind of military action. Freundlich left the building and did not return until after 2 a.m. To the FBI agents who followed him at a discreet distance, Freundlich appeared to be, quote, dry cleaning himself in the classic manner of a spy, changing trains and doubling back on his trail in an effort to lose any possible surveillance. It was an exercise that agents on both sides usually carried out before a meeting. He was not seen meeting with anyone that night, however. Jill Freundlich recalled one mysterious facet of Uncle Eddie's life. Edmund had one friend in the U.S. whom he referred to as Amigo. He never mentioned his name. The FBI was anxious to learn more about Freundlich and to determine, if possible, how he would communicate with the Soviets if he ever received a warning call from Wallflower. Although Cassidy's instructions were clearly meant to provide Moscow with advance warning of a U.S. attack on either the Soviet Union or another country, the FBI decided the instructions were general enough that he might be justified in making the call if a conflict anywhere in the world resulted in American forces being put on high alert. In May 1972, the military forces of India and Pakistan clashed in Kashmir. That could have been a sufficient pretext for the call. But at the time, U.S. forces were still deployed in Vietnam, and on May 8th, they mined Haiphong Harbor. Because of the possibility that the mining might escalate the conflict, STRICOM said, and American forces worldwide went to a DEFCON 4 state of alert. Following instructions from the FBI, Cassidy placed a call to Freundlich at his apartment and gave the parole inquiring about his supposed order for 22 books. He followed up with a letter in which, in secret writing, Cassidy advised Freundlich that the U.S. military had gone on a worldwide alert, which was true, with forces in the Pacific and at a higher degree of alert. To what extent the FBI considered the risk that the phone call might trigger a Soviet reaction is uncertain. Since the warning came in the context of an escalation in Vietnam and a possible war on the Indian subcontinent rather than an attack on the Soviet Union, perhaps they felt the danger was minimal. Yet the phone call warned of possible war. Cassidy stuck to the script and did not say anything specific about Kashmir or Haiphong. The language of the parole gave no clue that the warning related to regional conflicts. Only the follow-up letter pointed to Asia. One might conjure up a scenario out of Dr. Strangelove in which the Soviets panicked and persuaded that the United States was about to initiate a nuclear war, launch a preemptive first strike. As with the deception over nerve gas, risks were taken in the Cold War that may have seemed reasonable at the time, but in retrospect are chilling. As soon as Freundlich received Cassidy's warning call, he left his apartment and was gone for several hours. The FBI agents who had him under cautious surveillance believe he put his report in a dead drop near a building on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, but they could not be sure of that. As Robert C. Loughlin, one of the FBI agents, put it, after Ixora got the call and he reacted, the question was how close to get with our surveillance. If we went forward with a full court press, he would know we were into his knickers. In July 1972, 2 months after his telephone call to Freundlich, Cassidy traveled to Washington to meet with Mikhail Danilin. At the meeting, Cassidy recounted, I mentioned I had called the New York contact, and that Danilin was surprised. He looked a little bewildered, but passed it off right away and didn't question me. It was clear to me he didn't know what I was talking about. The FBI concluded that no one in the GRU had told Danilin about Cassidy's call. Certainly, Freundlich was under standing orders to report any call from Cassidy and possibly other sentinels. Perhaps they were real Soviet spies in the American military with similar instructions. There was no way to know. The cryptic call Ixora had received 6 months earlier might have come from a real spy, but either the GRU had cut Danilin out of the loop for some internal bureaucratic reason, or it had simply neglected to keep him informed. Danilin may well have let his organization know exactly how he felt about what had happened. On November 2nd, when Danilin asked Cassidy for specific military documents by name, implying the existence of a genuine mole, he also ordered him to destroy the instructions and parole for the telephone warning. He was directed to have no further contact with Edmund Freundlich. Uncle Eddie would receive no more calls from Joe Cassidy. But the FBI had plans for Ixora. Well, good morning to everyone. I see everyone in the chat. David Underdown, very prolific this morning. Ian Fleming lived in an island over in Jamaica. Yeah, he lived in Montego Bay. That's where Montego Bay got famous from. And now they have an international airport there, and flew into there one time when I went to see Bob Marley's mausoleum and to relax for a week. That was some time ago. I used to have long hair, and I don't know if you've seen the pictures of me with my Jamaican uh, hair, beads, and everything, but I really do love Jamaica and, sympathize with the tragedy of that country. Another country that's just been raped and murdered and destroyed in every possible way by the British, and still is being exploited for their bauxite and really a shame to see what the imperial system does to countries all over the world. Okay, I'll catch up with you guys later. One more chapter this morning, 14, The Big Apple. In June 1973, 4 months after he retired from the Army, Cassidy got a letter from his Soviet controllers instructing him to purchase a shortwave radio. Buy a new Zenith Royal 7000 radio, the message said. Do it outside your home city and without registering your name. Pay in cash. Cassidy acted on his instructions. Pardon me. I bought the radio for around $250, a Zenith Royal 7000 transoceanic, he said. I still have it. The Russians provided him with certain times and frequencies to listen to Radio Moscow on the mornings of the first and third Mondays of each month. The messages were transmitted in Morse code, in a cipher keyed to the same miniature dictionary, the Universal Webster, that Cassidy had been given by the Soviets nearly 7 years earlier. He used the dictionary to decipher the coded messages. In early September, Mikhail Danilin left Washington for the last time. Cassidy was told in the June letter that his next personal meeting with a new Mike was to take place in December in New York City, where Russian intelligence officers worked under diplomatic cover at the Soviet mission to the United Nations and in the UN Secretariat. Return in your package both special cameras unless you have a new job with an access to classified documents, the instructions continued. Your messages to me are okay, but in the future, try to leave larger margins on both sides of the top and at the bottom of the sheets you are writing on. Do not forget to steam my letter before developing. Finally, the letter asked Cassidy to brush up on his cryptography. It included 16 six-digit groups containing a coded test message. To refresh your skill in reading my coded messages, try to work out this one, the letter said. A few days before Christmas, Cassidy drove north from Florida to keep the rendezvous with the Russians. I had to drive, he recalled. If I flew, it would look funny going through security with a hollow rock full of film. The fake rock, it had also occurred to him, might look to security like a good place to hide drugs. Aside from Cassidy's concerns about airport security, he was going to need a car in New York to go to all the drop, signal, and meeting sites specified by the Russians. In the end, however, O'Flaherty decided to transport the rock north. In New York, Cassidy checked into a motel at Howard Beach, in Howard Beach, Queens, which, to the vast embarrassment of both Cassidy and the Bureau, turned out to be a hot sheet motel where patrons used it for quickie sex. Next day, Wallflower moved to the Hilton near John F. Kennedy International Airport. Meanwhile, O'Flaherty flew to New York from Tampa, carrying a gym bag with the hollow rock, which contained the 2 small cameras and films of secret documents that Cassidy had photographed before he retired. O'Flaherty, with his FBI credentials, would have no trouble going through security, but no one at the airport bothered to ask, why he was traveling with a rock in his carry-on bag. In New York, fortunately, O'Flaherty had not been booked at the seedy motel. He stayed with his mother in Rockaway Point, Queens, in the house where he had grown up. Cassidy's instructions from the Russians were, as always, detailed and meticulous. Come to New York City on December 22, 1973, he was told. At 2 p.m., leave your stuff at the following place. From 104th Street in Queens, walk west along 165th Avenue to its dead end. Put your package behind the right side of the concrete wall with railings preventing cars from going further. If for some reason the dead drop was not suitable, he was given a, quote, reserve place in Brooklyn. The meeting place with the new Mike was to be an antique shop in Brooklyn. At 4 p.m., come to the entrance to the Bees As Is at 3004 Avenue J. Stay there for 3 to 5 minutes. Then walk slowly along the right side of Avenue J. Turn right to New York Avenue. Turn right to Avenue K towards Nostrand Avenue. Have a book-sized package in yellow wrapping in your hand and a smoking pipe in your mouth. The instructions then supplied the seemingly odd parole that was to be used for identification. If someone approaches you and asks, "Could you tell me where is the nearest drive-in theater?" you should answer, "Beltsville Drive-In is the nearest I know, but the best one is Rockville Drive-In Theater." If no one approached Cassidy, he was told to, quote, repeat the whole thing on the next day. After the personal meeting with the new Mike, Cassidy was instructed to go to a dead drop in Brooklyn to pick up his rock. My package will be between the pole and metal fence going along 36th Street. The GRU was not making matters easy for Cassidy in the Big Apple. To signal that the pickup had taken place successfully, he was to drive all the way to the Yorkville section of Manhattan and place a horizontal line with a red marker on the lamp pole located at the southeastern corner of the intersection of the 1st Avenue and 90th Street near Mobil Gas Station in Manhattan, New York City. But not just anywhere on the pole. It should be put on the side of the lamp pole facing 1st Avenue and as high as approximately 3 to 4 feet from the ground. The Soviets undoubtedly wanted the mark to be facing the street at that height so it could easily be seen from a car driving by. If Cassidy failed to establish contact with the GRU on either day, he was given several alternate dates to appear at the antique shop. He was directed to come to New York City on the last Saturday of the month of each quarter, that is March 30th, June 29th, September 28th, and December 28th of 1974, until we meet at 4 p.m. Stay at the entrance to Bees As Is shop. But as if he received a postcard signed Mike, he was to appear at the shop at 4 p.m. 2 weeks after the date on the card. O'Flaherty met Cassidy in New York and gave him the hollow rock. At 2 p.m. Saturday, Cassidy hid the rock in the dead drop area in the dead drop in Queens. Then he drove to a shopping mall in Flatbush to kill time until the meeting. At 4 p.m., he was waiting in front of the antique shop, yellow package in hand and pipe in mouth. FBI agents had the shop and the entire area under surveillance. Cassidy did not have to start down the complicated route he had been given. A man approached and asked about the nearest drive-in theater. Cassidy gave the required reply. They began walking along the street, slowly talking as they went. The Russian introduced himself, not surprisingly, as Mike. He proved to be none other than Oleg I. Likachev, the same officer who had handled Cassidy for a time in Washington 4 years earlier, before Cassidy had been transferred to MacDill Air Force Base. Likachev, now stationed in New York, explained that the rock that Cassidy was to pick up in Brooklyn after their meeting would contain a vial of acetone, which he was to use in the future as the first step in developing secret writing. The Soviets had coated their invisible writing with a new protective chemical layer that required the use of acetone as a solvent before steaming the pages and crushing the capsules to develop the writing as before. When Ligachev confessed that he had not yet retrieved the rock that Cassidy had left 2 years earlier, Cassidy complained and pretended to be highly upset. The previous Mike, he let Ligachev know, had always cleared the dead drop quickly. Any delay, Cassidy implied, was jeopardizing his security. He did not need to spell out the reason for the GRU man. If someone happened to accidentally upon the rock, opened it, turned the film over to the authorities, the documents might be traced back to Cassidy. Ligachev sought to soothe the agent. "We really like you," he said. "You're number one with us." Now that Cassidy had returned to civilian life, Ligachev encouraged him to find employment that would continue to give him access to information of interest to the Russians. He suggested a map-making agency or a government printing office where regulations or manuals were produced. As they strolled along the Brooklyn streets, Ligachev worked the conversation around to his main purpose. "Do you have any trouble getting on military bases?" he asked. "No," Cassidy replied. "I have a sticker on my car." "We'd like you to make several trips around the country," Ligachev said. "You'll be traveling around, checking bases." He then assigned Cassidy to go to the Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, the nerve gas test site, and to several other military bases. At Dugway, where you see humps, especially look for humps with pipes on them. Let me know, and anything else you can find out about Dugway. The Russian also asked Cassidy to travel to Key West and find out how many submarines were based there. He was instructed as well to visit the Orlando Naval Training Center and a nuclear ammunition depot at the Air Force Base in Charleston. Finally, he was told to spy on a 1,700-acre former Army base at Slidell, Louisiana, across from New Orleans on the north side of Lake Pontchartrain. The base, once used as an artillery range, had been turned over to the Louisiana National Guard. The Soviets apparently suspected the Army was hiding nerve gas stocks at Slidell because they directed Cassidy to look for 20 mounds with pipes sticking up from them. The same configuration he was told to look for at Dugway. But Ligachev told Cassidy without explanation not to travel to the West Coast or New England. Finally, Ligachev pressed Cassidy to find a replacement for himself now that he had left the Army. "He wanted me to try to develop other sergeants," Cassidy recalled. "Did I know a sergeant who could do the work I was doing?" He said, "There is a weakness in every man. We try to exploit it." Cassidy realized he was in a delicate position. How could he satisfy the Soviets and still get out of the assignment? Cassidy remembered Nicky, a master sergeant at Edgewood Arsenal who had a job similar to his, but in the other lab. "I went up to Edgewood and took him and his wife to dinner to renew my friendship, to see if he was still there and had the same job." With the FBI's approval, Cassidy passed on the sergeant's name to the Soviets. Behind the scenes, the Bureau then warned Nicky that he might be contacted by a foreign intelligence service. The sergeant did receive a phone call from a foreigner, but the caller hung up. Later, the Russians urged Cassidy to set up a meeting between one of the Soviets and the new sergeant. But Cassidy refused, and he hit upon a good excuse. It was too risky for him. He warned the GRU, "I told the Soviets I didn't want to divulge to the sergeant what I was doing." After the meeting with Ligachev, Cassidy drove first to the dead drop to pick up his rock, then into Manhattan to leave the red mark on the lamp pole in Yorkville. Afterward, he made the long drive back to Queens to meet with O'Flaherty and other FBI agents waiting at the house in Rockaway Point. O'Flaherty recalled the scene. "We sat at this kitchen table and got a hammer and broke open the rock gently. We counted the money and looked for the microdot and the secret writing." It was close to midnight when Cassidy drove back to the Hilton. It had been a long day, but now, as a civilian, he had a new assignment. He was to crisscross the country spying on military bases for Moscow. Cassidy headed home for Florida, but there was a problem. It was the time of the gas shortage, and he was running low. On his way from New York, he drove through Springfield, Virginia, where Charlie Bevels lived, and at 2 a.m., quote, "We gave him 25 gallons of gas," Bevels recalled. "I think it was Christmas morning." For Cassidy, it was another Christmas day spent on the road, away from Marie. It was getting increasingly hard to explain to the neighbors. For some time now, the couple next door had been expressing curiosity about why Cassidy traveled so often. In St. Petersburg, Marie Cassidy said, the Mitchells, Bill and Betty May, especially Betty May, a school administrator, were suspicious. They wondered why Joe would go away for several days at a time. I would say, you know, the military, especially Strike Command, they're all over the place. No one else ever suspected. All right. The next chapter actually begins a secret medal, and it reminds me so much of the practically secret ceremony that they awarded my father's um, medal to him for. It was in a secret place in the Pentagon. So, well, with my father's birthday coming up tomorrow, I'll be thinking about him today and presenting a little bit of a birthday celebration tonight at 8 p.m. here on McDuff Channel. So I hope you will join us tonight, if possible, at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And we'll talk about my dad and celebrate his life in miniature, anticipating the celebration I'll be doing on June the 6th. Have a great afternoon. I'll talk to you tonight.